Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausan Pereira. India's COVID diplomacy at one of the worst global crises of recent decades is enabling Delhi to emerge as a responsible and reliable international power at a time when many established international actors have floundered. While neighboring countries are getting shipments of paracetamol and hydroxychloroquine, the government has also removed exports of COVID-19 drugs to countries such as the US, Spain, Brazil, Bahrain, Germany and the United Kingdom under commercial agreements signed with Indian pharmaceutical companies. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze India's COVID diplomacy. Joining me on the program today are Professor Swaran Singh, Chairperson, Centre for International Politics, JNU, Pramit Chaudhuri, Foreign Affairs Editor of the Hindustan Times, and Vishnu Prakash, former ambassador. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, let me start the program with you. Let's analyze India's COVID diplomacy over the last 1 month or so. We've been extremely proactive, really, as far as this coronavirus pandemic is concerned. We've been reaching out to countries around the world to try and collaborate and also extend a helping hand in this time of need.
Oh, absolutely. The way, in fact, it is heartening, gratifying to see that India is one of the handful of countries which has been extremely proactive, and we have been ahead of the curve in terms of taking decisions and difficult decisions. That is overall. But also in terms of reaching out to the Committee of Nations, we have done a very good job. You know, I wanted to bring in Frank that it's not the first time. India has been providing and cooperating with fellow developing countries and the others for the last 60 years, even when we did not have resources. And this time, even if you recall, in middle of February, we sent a plane load of material, face masks, gloves, etc. to even China, 15 tons of material. Our neighbors and the countries that you have enumerated far and wide. So it speaks volumes of how India conducts business. Certainly, we have taken care of our own needs. And yes, the comparison is quite stark. There is a country which has is threatened to use the relief material or pharmaceutical products as a leverage. There's another country which is denying it, but India has, I think, its own standing, and we have. I must say that we have, at this hour of need, reached out to our neighbors and friends proactively.
Okay, all right. And as far as this outreach is concerned, Professor, the Prime Minister is leading from the front. He has personally, held several conferences. We remember the SAARC initiative as well that was started by the Prime Minister, G20 after that, and also, of course, let's not forget, he's been speaking to several heads of state, heads of government personally to try and communicate to them, to try and find out how India can help, to also try and find out what's happening there and how we can use best practices to deal with this particular situation.
Frank, the pandemic COVID-19 has come with its own share of both opportunities and challenges. It has enormous advantage for leadership and countries which are, technology savvy, which are English speaking, which have been trying to digitize their life on everyday basis, particularly the governance part of it. And that, I think, clearly makes India advantage India in that sense. As you just mentioned, Indian Prime Minister has been holding video conferences both with his provincial chief ministers, with diplomats. He's initiated 2 summit meetings already. Officials are likewise attending several other teleconferencing. So there are advantages that India definitely has in sort of pushing the diplomatic efforts fast forward. India has advantage of being world's 3rd largest producer of pharmaceuticals in general. And interesting it is that they are all very cost effective. So when you count the same thing in value terms, India is 13th in terms of volume versus value of these pharmaceuticals. Of course, we also have to remember that there are also challenges. For instance, the Prime Minister's enormous and rather celebrated diplomatic footwork has clearly come to a halt. He was supposed to attend the India-Europe summit meeting and then go there via Egypt He was also mid-March supposed to go to Bangladesh to be part of the centenary celebrations of Mujibur Rahman's birth celebrations. So a certain amount of limitations have come in place, and he was known for his hectic footwork in diplomacy in terms of traveling and meeting people, which has come to a halt. But he's also using Prime Minister and entire diplomatic establishment of India is clearly using technology, and of course has advantage of pharmaceutical industry. It is also creating an example in keeping the curve extremely low. Numbers are low as of now, which is a very inspiring thing for several other countries. So I think we are trying fundamentally to maximize our advantages, maximize the opportunities that come through the spread of COVID-19. And of course, we also have to deal with creating alternatives to overcome the challenges that it throws upon Indian diplomacy.
Okay, all right. We'll talk about the challenges and we'll talk about those aspects as well ahead in the program. But Pramit, as far as this particular issue itself is concerned, do you believe that global governments have been dragging their feet to try and collaborate, try and cooperate and coordinate with each other?
Yeah, there has actually been remarkably bad coordination. The multilateral is not coming through this with any shining successes. We have seen the U.S. and China squabble over the WHO, which has resulted in America at least threatening to provide no longer provide funding to the WHO. So it's actually symbolic because the money would only stop coming next year. We've seen in the United Nations, China and Russia have blocked any attempt to discuss the COVID crisis. The G20 summit did hold an online meeting, but only at the request, only after India took the initiative to do so. Within even the European Union, which has existing protocols regarding how they should cooperate in during a medical emergency, there was initially a sort of my nation first policy where European countries blocked shipments of medical supplies to each other. And as you know, the two halves of Europe, the North and the South, have squabbled over the question of issuing special emergency financial bonds, so-called Corona bonds, in an attempt to respond to the economic problems caused by the COVID-19 crisis. So overall, we have not seen great international cooperation yet. And the hope is, and I have to admit right now it's a relatively meager hope, that after the crisis is over, there will be a renewed attempt to look upon this as an international concern that requires international cooperation on a whole host of India, fortunately, seems to be agreeable to both the U.S. and China camps. We have, for example, the U.S. Deputy Secretary of State meets eight counterparts across Asia, including India, to discuss how to respond to the crisis, and held a video conference as it did in early March. Called in 10 countries, of which India was also in the list.
Right. Okay. All right. Taking the discussion forward now, Ambassador. Of course, there is tremendous goodwill as far as India is concerned. India releasing the crucial hydroxychloroquine drug has come under a lot of support. Several, the U.S. President and others too have come out and thanked Prime Minister Modi for actually making the drug available internationally. So, can we use this goodwill and convert it into good diplomacy going forward?
Fact remains, Frank, that the shelf life of goodwill is limited, and the only thing that countries, and why countries, even people, human beings remember is slight. You slight somebody, and that is remembered a lifetime. You do a favor to somebody, it kind of recedes back into memory. That said, we have never flaunted what we have done. In the past we have never, and nor are we going to flaunt it. For us, it's an article of faith to be the net security provider, and health security is also an integral part of security, whether it's physical security or food security or help assistance in times of disasters. Now, but that said, it will also means that the image of India is certainly being burnished, because while individual countries may or may not remember or may choose or not to choose to reciprocate, but the image, it's a part of now history. It's a part of what the academics and the scholars and the strategic community and the diplomats and the other countries will remember. And what will be remembered, even if not by the beneficiary country, but the Committee of Nations, is that in the hour of need, India came forward. So yes, it will, I think, burnish the image of India further, which is generally positive, and this would help that further. And it is indeed very gratifying that the speed at which India has been responding to requests. I mean, you were mentioning about some of the urgent relief material. Countries have reached a stage where they don't even have paracetamol. I mean, imagine that the dependence of major countries on a big country extends to even paracetamol. So that is the kind of situation or the hole that the world has dug itself in.
Absolutely. Professor, since we are here, how do we ensure that we keep this momentum going once the lockdowns are lifted, once we see some semblance of normalcy? We know that this is here to stay for a while, but once we see some kind of normalcy, how do we keep this momentum going?
I think that's a very interesting question that you have raised, because usually when any war comes to an end, there's a ceasefire and then diplomatic activity gets, in fact, in hyperactive mode, so that to learn from the crisis and to make sure those things don't happen again. But here, the crisis is pushing us to stay home, and it's really locking down the entire human universe, including diplomacy. The biggest hub of diplomacy in the world is United Nations. Now we are asking question whether the General Assembly is going to have the session on 22nd September or it is going to postpone it. The global diplomacy happens there. Each country showcases its advantages, its strengths in those parleys over a cup of coffee, in the lounge, in evening receptions. That meeting is under question. Already, for instance, the Human Rights Council has postponed its session indefinitely. The Conference on Disarmament has postponed. These are the forums where India can showcase its leverages and then showcase its strengths over a period of time. And I'm not sure if diplomacy will come back to as it was. In fact, there are so many interesting things that diplomatic corps has to now learn and unlearn. After First World War, for example, President Wilson of United States had given very important 14 points, and on the punchline was, now onwards we'll have open covenants, openly arrived at. Now shifting to IT, voting through emails. For example, 53 countries within 2 or 3 days have voted yes for UN General Secretary's appeal for ceasefire worldwide. So a whole new set of skills, whole new set of infrastructure is being built. So diplomacy may never remain the same as it was. You will have increasingly transparency, increasingly openness injected enormously, whereas secretive nature of parleys and confidentiality was very important to diplomacy. That might disappear for good now. So in many ways, we don't know how things will turn out once we begin to believe that the curve is flattening, which will take very long time. And I think India has to really learn those skills, how to live in that new normal. And I think that is already a little bit visible of India being IT power, India being IT savvy, Indian infrastructure shifting in digital sort of economy, smart cities, etc., etc. So we have to really begin to think what will be the assets and strengths of diplomacy for India in post-COVID-19 period. And it's not going to be the old diplomacy, and I think we fully understand, and India is moving in that direction very quickly.
I think that's a very interesting point that you made there, Professor. I'm going to take that aspect forward. Pramit, what do you believe is going to be the biggest challenge going forward for Indian diplomats?
I think there's going to be the biggest challenge we'll face, which is, if you wish, a partly economic one, Dr. Singh mentioned, is that even before the crisis had broken out, there was already a beginning of a tendency to see the world start to fracture into, should we say, regional groupings built around technology standards, of which the question of 5G telecom standards was the most obvious one. There were other technology standards. Another area we may now find out is in the medical supply chain and the medical transparency issues, where we may see another cluster of countries, uh, uh, several clusters develop independently of each other. To some degree, we already had that in trade, but with the decline of the WTO, that fracturing was accelerated. India, a country that is not officially in any other country's camp, which has no military alliances, and is not even a particularly big, we'll have to work a manner in which and technology and finance from many parts of the world, not just the West, but also Southeast Asia, to some degree China, Japan. We need to be able to keep those doors open, even as the rest of the world starts to build up barriers to each other. And we're seeing right now, in the midst of the pandemic, for example, Germany, Europe, the whole America, imposing barriers on mergers and acquisitions by Chinese companies in their countries. A Harvard professor was arrested for accepting money and transferring technology to China, and so forth. So you're seeing that happening across and the pandemic will only accelerate and accentuate that trend. So we have to be able to build bridges across the board to different groups to be able to keep our options and to be able to access the things and items that we need to keep our own economic growth continuing.
Okay, all right. There's no doubt that the road ahead is going to be a difficult one and a challenging one. So let's talk about the best way forward. And closing comments now from all my guests, starting first with the ambassador.
Well, there are two parts of, or I am conflicted. On the one hand, one knows the human tendency of reverting or getting back to business as usual. When the crisis passes, you say, all right, let's get back to our old ways. But I feel that this time it should serve as a wake-up call to every country in different ways. Globalization will be impacted. The global supply chains will get impacted. In fact, there will be a supply shock. I would think that one country which will have to pay the price, or which will be the biggest loser, is our northern neighbor. Now, you mentioned very well, you made a very good comment saying that coronavirus brings in lots of challenges, but also opportunities. We are facing the challenges at the moment, but question really is that the economic growth of every country, including India, will take a hit. Now, post-coronavirus, how do we harness the opportunities is the big challenge for us. And here, I guess, there is also an opportunity because it gives us an opening for finally moving ahead meaningfully and expeditiously on the path of industrialization. And that would also accelerate the GDP growth rate, which we need. And somehow I have a feeling that we will be embarking on that path also.
Okay, all right, Professor.
I think there's an ongoing debate for about 2 decades as we moved into infusion of technology, that embassies was an old-fashioned, expensive and inefficient way of conducting diplomacy. Some of that might get revived. That debate will come up again. Second, very quickly, is that as we will see the health shock, demand shock and supply shock, the economic hit would mean that expensive and overreach side of diplomacy will have to be controlled and reorganized. So I think to some extent, this shift to information technology and digitization is going to be long run, and that is particularly so because COVID-19 is not going away in a hurry. The estimates that United States has put it is that impact will last as long as 2023. So it's not going to go away very quickly, and I think we will have learned several new tricks by that time, and we will have adopted them as a habit. So we may not fall back to the old habit as Ambassador just mentioned. So this might actually inject a final new change the way we conduct India's diplomacy and how global diplomacy is conducted.
India's diplomacy needs to evolve with the times, is what you're suggesting. And let's say, over the years, our diplomats have shown us that they've got that skill of doing so, and we have full faith in our diplomats that going forward too, we can adapt with the times. All right, Pramit, close the show for us with your concluding remarks. Pramit, if you can hear me, close the show for us with your concluding remarks with the best way forward.
I think that, well, partly we have to wait to see how long the pandemic continues and how much damage it leaves in its path, both economically and medically, because it's really an unknown known that this when exactly is going to come to an end. So we will see how it plays. But I think the sense in a lot of governments is that if they do not act and handle this sensibly, at least in the perception of the general public, you're going to see a number of governments fall or be severely damaged. And at the end of it also, all governments, and I definitely think this is true in the Indian case, want to ensure that their economy is still doing relatively well. And when I'm saying that, I mean any growth figure above 0% is probably good enough this year for most economies in the world. So that they can be certain that they will take advantage, perhaps, of what follows, both economically and politically across the world. India has decided to take on a lot of the hard choices, especially in terms of economic lockdown, right at the beginning, holding back a lot of its economic fire, if you wish, in the form of fiscal stimulus and so on, till later. Because it wants to hold those. And so we'll see how this plays out. And if fortunate, I think if we are able, as it looks like we might be able to hold on to our broad economic conditions, even though at a lower rate of growth, but relative to the rest of the world, it's still quite good, we may come out rather well in comparison to other parts of the world by the end of this year or the beginning of next.
Okay, all right. On that note, then, we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.